You find yourself in a small LGS in July. The walls are lined with posters from various games. It smells of pack-fresh trading cards and not-so-fresh bodies. You head to the counter. The shopkeeper's name tag says Dave. That'll be $15. Dave hands you 3 packs. What the? This isn't a core set. It says Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. You open your first pack and are instantly assaulted by 10 different draft archetypes. Which will you choose? Roll for initiative. Black-Red goes first, and it is all about treasures. Its payoffs are, well, treasure is its own reward. But I guess there's also Kalain, who turns your treasures into +1/+1 counters, and Orcus, who you can dump a lot of mana into, and Skullport Merchant, who recycles treasures or creatures into card draw, and finally Forsworn Paladin, who creates treasures and gives you a mana sink to make your creatures a lot scarier. On top of that, there are several cards that get upgraded if you spend a treasure to cast them. So how are you going to get treasure in the first place? Well, while there are enough ways to make treasures that this deck is viable, there aren't so many that you can afford to be picky. But there are some neat combos. Shambling Ghast creates a treasure when it dies, and Deadly Dispute helps it do that. Then you can follow that up with a Grim Wanderer and be attacking for 5 damage on turn 3. Thieves' Tools makes a treasure and can help your Horde Robber and Hoarding Ogre do the same. Grim Bounty is great to stave off the opponent's plan while advancing your own. Plundering Barbarian, Improvised Weaponry, Unexpected Windfall, these cards are all a bit overcosted, which is a double-edged sword. It means you'll be playing inefficient spells, but on the other hand, you'll have treasure to help with the cost, and other players won't be drafting these very highly, so you can probably get as many as you want. Now, I think you really want some decent payoffs to even attempt this deck, but remember that treasure is ramp, so any good expensive spell can count as a payoff. White-Blue is based on the new mechanic Venture into the Dungeon, but it doesn't just rush in willy-nilly. White-Blue is playing a slow, controlling dungeon deck. Its signpost uncommon is Hama Pashar Ruinseeker, who doubles every single room trigger when you venture. This means that the incremental value you're gaining just became a little less incremental. She's a great build-around. There are 2 other main reasons to get into the deck. The first is Nadar, Selfless Paladin, who gives your creatures +1/+1 if you've completed a dungeon, and is one of the cheapest repeatable venture cards. The second is Teleportation Circle, despite not having the word dungeon in its text. This is amazing if you pair it with White-Blue's 5 creatures that venture when they enter the battlefield, because you'll be accruing value each turn. Other dungeon payoffs include Cloister Gargoyle, who blocks okay early and turns into a threat once you've dungeoned sufficiently, and Gloomstalker, who does the same thing, but with the name of a black card. Once you're in the archetype, there is no shortage of ways to spend an excessive amount of mana to venture. My favorites are Secret Door, because it's a solid early game blocker, and Dungeon Map, because it ramps you into your late game. Bar the Gate is also quite good. For 3 mana, it counters the most important types of spells in Limited while advancing your dungeon. Now, which dungeons do you want to focus on? Tomb of Annihilation is a no-go. No matter which route you choose, it costs you resources, and control decks are trying to make it through the early game with as many resources as possible. You just can't afford to be paying life and sacrificing creatures when you're weak to aggro. If you have a lot of cards that want you to complete a dungeon, Lost Mine of Phandelver is your best bet. It's only 4 rooms long, and it has a couple decent control options. Also, the Goblin token works well with Nadar. If you have a lot more ways to venture consistently, I recommend the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. It's 7 rooms long, but it has a lot of card advantage options along the way. Remember that you can choose any dungeon you want each game, so you don't have to commit until your first venture, but once you've started, you can't switch dungeons until you finish. White-Blue also has a minor 2 spells per turn theme, as seen on Monk class and Monk of the Open Hand. These are the only cards that care about it, so don't look for this, but if you do find these cards, you'll want to prioritize cantrips like Shocking Grasp and Potion of 50 gold is too dang much. Like White-Blue, White-Black is very dungeon-centric. Unlike White-Blue, it's a lot more focused on trading off creatures. Triumphant Adventurer is a great reason to get into the deck. It has Death Touch, so it can trade off. It has First Strike on your turn, so it just kills any potential blocker, and it ventures when it attacks. It's really hard to block, and it's going to accrue a lot of value if left unchecked. Then there's Barrowin of Clan Under. Whenever this guy attacks, you get to reanimate a creature with 3 or less mana value if you've completed a dungeon. This means you want to trade off your Yuan Ti Fangblades and your Gloomstalkers, complete a quick dungeon, and start bringing them back to life. Tomb of Annihilation is your best friend here. You can afford to pay life, or stock your graveyard by discarding, or sacrificing creatures like Dungeon Crawler, or Shambling Ghast. You could rush through to get to the Atropal, but there's actually a good reason to be patient. Aside from the fact that sacrificing lands in Limited is generally bad, white-black decks have another strategy at play here: Drain. You can hit your opponent's life total directly with Warlock class, Herald of Hadar, or Reaper's Talisman. This deck wants to pressure the opponent's life hard, and taking the long path through the tomb gives your opponent an unpleasant choice. In the Veils of Fear, they can lose 2 life, making it easier for you to drain them to death, or they can discard a card, which you can capitalize on by playing Demogorgon's Clutches to leave them with an empty hand. In the Sandfall Cell, they can again lose 2 life, but if they choose to sacrifice a creature, it's that much easier for your horde to keep attacking and advancing your dungeon. If they sacrifice a land, it's going to be harder for them to cast spells to catch up. And remember, you can complete the same dungeon more than once. This deck is all about depriving your opponents of creatures, cards, and ultimately, their life. Remember to get on the board early so you can apply that pressure, otherwise you will lose in the late game. Our last major dungeon deck is blue-black. While you could play this deck similarly to white-black, you want to focus more on evasive creatures and less on trading off. There are numerous cards that reward you for dealing combat damage to the opponent. You can venture with Shortcut Seeker, both of the Yuan Ti, or Fly, grow your board with Guild Thief, Westgate Regent, Trickster's Talisman, or Drider, or draw cards with Soul Knife Spy, Imarith, Grazilax, Krydal, and Rogue class. Now many of these cards have their own evasion, but for those that don't, it's important to find ways to get them through. Krydal and Rogue class are both excellent cards for this deck because they serve as both payoff and enabler. But you don't just need higher rarity cards. You can use You Come to a River, Mordenkainen's Polymorph, or Baleful Beholder to give evasion for a turn. Or you can punish blocking with Feign Death or Manticore. This deck is going to be one of the easiest to get into because it has so many pieces at common. And evasion is its own reward. If your opponent can't block, they just lose. Dungeon-wise, this archetype is the most open. The Storeroom in Phandelver can make one of your Saboteurs a little harder to block effectively, or you can use Tomb of Annihilation much the same way white-black would. Or you can play a more controlling version of the deck with more removal and counterspells, maybe aim to win the game with Vorpal Sword, and take your time to get the huge card advantage from the Mad Mage. Red-Green is all about friendship, going to the mall, getting mani-pedis, brutally murdering a hapless adventurer party. The pack that slays together stays together. And Pack Tactics helps you do just that. Werewolf Pack Leader is the best payoff. Its trigger draws you a card, which makes sure that you can keep adding to the pack even as they trade off in combat. It can also pump itself to almost trigger Tactics by itself. Targnar is the signpost uncommon, and it's a bit odd. It's like it's trying to go both wide and tall at the same time. Now, going tall will only be a great payoff if you can do it twice in a turn, and that's a lot of mana, so I'd focus on going wide with things like Battlecry Goblins, Swarming Goblins, and You See a Pair of Goblins, and using Targ's pump ability to get to 6 power if you're just a bit short. Null Hunter grows big, and Tiger Tribe Hunter can fling your randos at the enemy. Actually, every Pack Tactics card except Minion of the Mighty seems pretty good for limited. Now obviously, you want to pair these cards with each other, because if you're triggering one of them, you're triggering all of them. But if you need to venture outside the pack for aid, you want to look for creatures with a high power to mana value ratio. Lurking Roper is great. Even if you aren't focusing on life gain, your first venture into the Mad Mage's dungeon will untap it, and 1 or 2 Pack Tactics triggers may be all you need to get your value back. Eltragard Ranger provides 6 power over 2 bodies for some staying power, and of course you can use pump spells, though this can be dangerous as you'll need to cast them before combat to trigger Pack Tactics. Green-White is in the life gain business. Trelasara, Celestial Unicorn, and Cleric class all turn your life gain into +1/+1 counters, and I already mentioned Lurking Roper, who is just a really efficient creature if you can gain life consistently. Notice that none of these cards care about how much life you gain, which means you want to focus on gaining lots of instances of life rather than big chunks. Prosperous Innkeeper, Sylvan Shepherd, Steadfast Paladin, and Druid class are the way to go here, with the potential to gain you life every single turn. But in the absence of those, you always have access to a single life gain if you can venture into the dungeon. Remember that when you're gaining life, it's hard to race you, so you have the luxury of picking your battles. Don't trade off your creature that's growing every turn if it's going to get too big for the opponent to deal with. Just be patient and wait for your opening. Dice rolling can be tricky. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. So in blue-red, it's important to play cards that don't care whether you win or lose. Farida becomes basically unblockable, Brazen Dwarf sits back on defense and pings your opponents to death, and Feywild Trickster builds an unparalleled air force. In addition, Pixie Guide and Barbarian class give you advantage, doubling your chances of beating the DC. Now, once you have a couple of these, you need some dice rolling cards. The ones you should focus on are... any of them? I mean, I guess the cards that can roll dice repeatedly will help you trigger your payoffs more consistently. Things like Arcane Investigator, Chaos Channeler, Delina, and Hoarding Ogre. But even the one-off spells like Contact Other Plane, Genie Windseer, Swarming Goblins, and Earth Cult Elemental are good spells without even winning the roll. Add to that the fact that you have a 55% chance of winning, and you don't need payoffs to have these cards be good plays. There isn't too much complicated strategy here. The main thing I want to leave you with is that you should assume that Critical Hit is never going to come back to you. Evaluate it as though it's a one-time double strike spell, and see if you still want it. If so, great, maybe you can get some extra mileage out of it in this deck, but don't bet on it. So many flavor words, and they left out Morbid. Screw you, tragic backstory. I hate you, Whispers of the Grave. Black-green wants creatures to die, usually on your turn. This isn't a huge archetype, but the payoffs that exist here are definitely worth building around. Shesra is a card draw engine that can also force an opposing creature to block. This means you may want to pair her with a Death Touch creature like Underdark Basilisk, or something like Elterguard Ranger, who gives 2 bodies and trades off like nobody's business. Purple Worm is ridiculous, weighing in at 8/7 for just 5 mana. Death Priest of Mirkul and Skeletal Swarming provide you with endless skeleton tokens, which can build up a lethal board or just die to keep triggering your Morbid. Warlock class drains your opponents slowly but surely, and you even have a couple of very solid common payoffs. Now these payoffs don't care if they were in play when the creature died, so most of the time you'll want to attack into an opposing creature, hope they trade, and then drop your payoff post-combat when it's too late for the opponent to play around it. Once your opponent realizes you're playing cards that care about creatures dying, they might just stop blocking, so you're going to want some ways to ensure that the battlefield is no safe haven. You can sacrifice your own creatures with Sepulchre Ghoul, Skullport Merchant, Deadly Dispute, or Tomb of Annihilation. Shambling Ghast and Prosperous Innkeeper are both good candidates for death, and they both leave you with a treasure, but you know what's better than sacrificing your own creatures? Rice-A-Roni, the San Francisco treat. Oh, and killing your opponent's stuff. That was the correct answer. Sure, you'll need to play removal at sorcery speed to trigger your payoffs, but that's a price worth paying. Power Word Kill, Precipitous Drop, and Spoils of the Hunt are all excellent ways to kill those who would cross you by eating your Rice-A-Roni from the communal fridge that didn't have your name on it, Linda. For the first time ever, Red-White is all about equipment. Bruenor Battlehammer gives each of your creatures 2 power for each equipment it has, and lets you equip for free once each turn. Blink Dog is a 1/1 double strike for 3 that lets you pay 4 mana to phase it out, which means that it and anything attached to it disappear until the beginning of your next turn. This means that you can suit it up with a bunch of equipment, and as long as you hold up 4 mana, your opponent can't kill it. These 2 cards are the main reasons to go into this deck. Once you're here, though, there are several other creatures worth suiting up. Dwarfhole Champion is an aggressive creature that gains toughness when it's equipped. That means you can attack with it, and if your opponent tries to trade, flash equip a Dueling Rapier or Paladin's Shield to win the combat. Armory Veteran has menace so long as it's equipped, so a Boots of Speed or Spare Dagger is a cheap way to give it some power and evasion. And Oswald Fiddlebender lets you turn your small equipment into bigger, better equipment. Beyond the creatures that mention equipment, remember that any creature with keyword abilities can be a good equipped target. And there are lots of equipment to choose from as well. The flash equipment I mentioned before are great picks, but you also really want Dancing Sword, Goblin Morningstar, and or Icing Death. See, the problem with equipment decks is that in order to make room for your equipment spells, you often have to decrease the number of creatures that you play, which is a problem because equipment need creatures to actually do anything. Maybe you get a good creature out, spend a bunch of mana to equip everything, and then your opponent kills it, leaving you with a bunch of useless artifacts. So every card you can get that is both an equipment and a creature increases your consistency significantly. For a similar reason, every spell you play that gives you more than one creature gives you an advantage. Green-blue is all about drawing cards and playing lands. Gretchen Titchwillow lets you do both, to no one's surprise. Skilled Herbalist and Druid class also let you play extra lands, but if you want to have any left in hand to play, you'll need to draw some extra cards. I suggest you happen upon a glade, or contact other plane. Find the Path is also decent ramp, though it only produces green mana. Now once you have all that mana, you want some heavy hitters to spend it on. The Tarask may just be too expensive, but I'm definitely going to try to play it if I open it. X spells like Ochre Jelly and Long Rest scale with your mana, giving you good plays at any point in the game. Wizard's Spellbook lets you cast instants and sorceries from your graveyard again, so if you get this one, make sure to draft some solid removal spells like Spoils of the Hunt or Split the Party. Now if you find Volo, Guide to Monsters, you may want to adjust your strategy. He straight up copies your creature spells as long as they don't share a creature type with anything else in your graveyard or battlefield. This is very powerful. Now Volo is a human wizard, so we specifically have to avoid those types. The easiest way to do that is to draft creatures with just one type. These tend to be one-offs, like a Djinn, Elemental, Beast, or Wolf. Just make sure that the creatures you're focusing on are good enough to want to copy. Now, being the colors of ramp means you are also the most likely place to build a 5-color deck. There are 3 main reasons to branch out into said deck. The first is Volo. He'll let you copy the most powerful creatures from every color, and there's more creature type variety the more colors you play. The second and third reason are the same. Bard class and Instrument of the Bards both pay you off for playing a lot of legendary creatures. There aren't that many options in any given color pair, but every Signpost uncommon is a legendary creature, as well as some of the Signpost rares. Now, you don't even have to go 5-color. Just start with red, because that lets you play Bard class, capitalize on Targnar's doubling ability, and give you access to more treasure for mana fixing. Now, let's talk about build-arounds that don't fit into the normal archetypes. Black Staff of Waterdeep costs 1 mana for an artifact that lets you pay 2 mana to turn a non-token artifact into a 4/4 for as long as the staff remains tapped. Plus, you can choose not to untap it on your turn. This card is great because once your 4/4 dies, you just make another. In order to make this work, you need a steady stream of non-token artifacts. The best one is Potion of Healing. For 2 mana, it replaces itself, and it's not a high pick, so you can probably find a few of them. Tasha's Hideous Laughter mills each opponent until they've milled 20 mana value of cards. So how likely is it that you mill someone out? I've put together what I think is a reasonable mana curve for limited, and the average mana value is 1.9. This means that you can expect to mill about 10.5 cards each time you cast this spell. That is absolutely a decent finisher. You want to play a slow, controlling game with lots of card draw so that you find Tasha's Laughter and Aberrant Mind Sorcerer to let you replay it. The final level of Sorcerer class deals damage to opponents whenever you play an instant or sorcery, especially when playing multiple in one turn. To make the most of this, you want cantrips like You Find Some Prisoners or Shocking Grasp, control cards like You Find the Villain's Lair or Split the Party, and creature token spells like You See a Pair of Goblins or Swarming Goblins. This set has a lot of cool stuff in it, and I am so excited to be able to play with dungeons, class enchantments, and hopefully capture that authentic Murder Hobo feel. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to like, and if you want to see more draft guides in the future, remember to subscribe.